Hello. Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. Today I'm going to be giving a talk on the challenges in Latin American education access in Texas from 1900 to the present. My name is Joseph Wood, and this is a graduate level presentation being done for the Southern Methodist University um, under the course of Race, Power, and Politics in the School of Education. So I want to start out this talk today really discussing the historical challenges to equal educational access for Latin Americans. Later on, we're going to move into a discussion of more current situations and challenges within Texas. And I'm hoping that this talk today will be able to give you an idea of where we've been, in particular with how some of these national movements have impacted Texas and Latino Americans in Texas, and how some of those historical trends, as well as what's happening recently, still impacts this very important community to Texas culture, Texas society, and the Texas economy as well. So I want to start out discussing some of the early 20th century issues, really from around 1900 to about the 1950s. Before I can really jump into that and really give some explanation on that, it's important to at least mention, without going into too much detail, on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was signed in 1848. The reason this is such a foundational document is because when the territory of Texas was signed over and became a republic of its own, separating from Mexico, this was a seminal document that guaranteed many cultural rights, linguistic rights, and really many property rights as well to Mexican citizens who were opting or choosing to stay in the state, in the new Republic of Texas, contribute to that republic, but to have their personal rights and their cultural rights safeguarded. As has been seen very directly since the signing of that document between Mexico and the new Republic of Texas at that time, many of these rights were not allowed or provided to Hispanics that remained, and the greater Latin American community that have become residents in Texas since that time. With that, I want to kind of move into the 20th century and talk about a couple of key trends and movements. It's important to point out that in 1915 is when Texas passed a compulsory education law. This was something that many different states were doing individually. Texas was one of 5 states that had yet to pass it, and that's significant because it kind of sets a tone for the fact that Texas is always been lagging behind in the development of educational benefits and opportunities for the Latin American community. Just to put this into a bit of perspective, you can see that by 1900, only 7% of Latin American or Hispanic American students were enrolled in school, as compared to 39% for white students in the state of Texas. By 1928, those numbers had climbed to 49%, but they still lagged behind significantly their white counterparts at 83%. One of the important kind of trends to point out here is that even though from 1900 to 1928 there was a significant increase in the number of Latinos who were enrolled in school, as you can see from the numbers, the gap between student enrollments only widened further over this time period. So while numerical gains were made, there were other challenges as well. It's also important to point out that in this time period, even though there are enrollment gains happening and there's increased access for Latino students, segregation is still the most common practice. It was during this time period that many white schools were separated from quote unquote Mexican schools or black schools within Texas, and this was the common practice up until several years later, which I'll mention in just a moment. it's also during this time period about, we start getting into the 1920s, 1930s, that there is sort of a key core group of active Latinos that become somewhat more educated. They have more social capital, more financial assets that they are starting to develop and gain generationally. And those resources, communal resources and financial resources, they're putting towards gaining more access and opportunity for Latinos in Texas. One of the key indicators of that is the founding of LULAC, or the League of United Latin American Citizens, in Corpus Christi, Texas, my hometown. This was a major milestone because it was one of the very first lobbying groups and coherent coalitions to actively work on behalf of Latino educational rights and many other rights, but educational rights being sort of the focus here for Latinos in the state of Texas. This kind of leads into several significant court cases that were fought out and decided from the state of Texas. First one being Del Rio ISD versus Salvatierra, and in this case, this was a situation where Salvatierra was suing against, and the other plaintiffs were suing against the creation of these quote-unquote Mexican schools. This was a ruling that did not go in the favor of the plaintiffs, and Del Rio ISD was allowed by the courts to continue to have segregated schools as long as it was not solely based on race. So essentially, school systems around 1930 could still create separate educational environments, but they had to do some way of not overtly making it about racial distinctions, which schools were easily able to navigate that criteria. So this was a step back. It was an unsuccessful attempt to desegregate the school systems within Texas. However, in 1948, some 18 years later, under Delgado versus Bastrop ISD, this was a situation in which Delgado and the other plaintiffs argued to make school segregation illegal. This was ultimately successful. The courts did rule in favor of Delgado. However, the main challenge here was that even after the ruling was passed, many schools found ways to subvert or just outright not comply with the ruling because anti-desegregation and racial sentiments amongst the white community were still very strong, especially in these rural communities. As we kind of get later into the 20th century, one thing to point out is that under several administrations in the 1970s and 1980s, there was very little appetite to address major educational issues, especially when it comes to creating more opportunity for minority groups. And this can be seen under Nixon, Reagan, and Carter administrations, Democrat and Republican. Very little was done in the way of proactive education legislation. And so lots of the challenges that arose during this time period was because of this lack of national attention on the issue that we still see today, and to some degree. And all the gains that were happening during this time period were very much grassroots legal and social movements. This was all in spite of the MAES, Mexican American Educational Study, that was put out, multiple segments put out between 1970 and 1974. This was a very damning report that essentially showed through statistics that the Mexican American community was being underserved and these issues being ignored. The summary of the report was very damning for the national education system. But despite this report, there's very little movement done during the 1970s and into the 1980s. One notable case in Texas with regards to these developments is Cisneros versus Corpus Christi ISD. And in this case, the Independent School District of Corpus Christi was attempting to continue segregation policies by having Hispanics and blacks being put in mixed schools together. And this was legally allowing them to keep whites separate from these minority groups. At the time, Hispanics and Latinos were considered other non-white, or sorry, excuse me, other white population, and so it allowed them to have schools with only Hispanic students and Black students, and that school was considered desegregated. This then allowed them to have other schools where whites could attend by themselves. This case was eventually ruled in favor of Cisneros, and it made pairing Black and Hispanic students uh, as a situation to satisfy desegregation illegal, and it made a direct ruling with regards to making Hispanics an identifiable minority group, so that they no longer could be used as essentially a legal pawn for many southern states, including Texas, in order to satisfy desegregation legislation that they did not want to comply with. As we kind of approach the end of the 20th century, especially with regards to Texas, we get into cases that are very representative, such as Plyer v. Doe, where there's some progress made here in 1982. This case made it so that undocumented migrants were able to gain educational access. So some grassroots progress for sure. What was so notable about this is it made it so that if you were an undocumented worker, undocumented student, you could not be denied free education by the public education system. This meant there was wider access for those Hispanic families whose children were undocumented and could take advantage of those full benefits. That being said, when we start getting into the 1990s, we start to see increased anti-Latino sentiment. This includes anti-bilingual education. There are racial issues and immigration issues that start to become more emphasized during the 1990s, and as we've seen, has only really grown in the early 2000s. Some of the gains that are made during the 20th century also start to see some challenges. One of these examples are with Hopwood versus University of Texas Law School, in which the courts ruled against affirmative action for that school. And Hopwood, along with several other white defendants, were claiming that the university was removing or disqualifying their ability to get access to the school because they were using race as a key qualifier for gaining access to the University of Law School. There have been a lot of studies that have shown that this has very little effect overall, but nonetheless, Hopwood and some cases since then, such as Fisher of University of Texas, have had this same ruling. Universities have attempted to create more quote-unquote comprehensive admissions processes, and currently some forms of these are in the courts as well. Affirmative action obviously still continues to be a controversial and contentious legal battle between pro and anti-affirmative action camps. But in the case of Hopwood versus University of Texas, immediately after this court ruling in 1996, one of the things that was really striking was how Mexican American enrollment decreased by 60% at the law school following the removal of affirmative action enrollment criteria. As we sort of move into the early 2000s and the early 21st century, one of the things that is very noticeable and something that is quite impactful on Texas is the increased visibility by No Child Left Behind, or the NCLB, as under the Bush administration, as well as Every Child Succeeds Act under the Obama administration. Taken all together, kind of taking a step back and looking at the big picture, these are bills that created, yes, increased visibility, but limited progress. The results of these two policies are mixed. And so I want to talk a little bit about the things that they were able to achieve and some of the things that they weren't. First, with No Child Left Behind, I think one of the key legacies of this legislation, and specifically to Texas, is the fact that No Child Left Behind did really put the spotlight on marginalized groups, or groups that would have a significantly greater need. So whether this be ethnic minority groups, or whether this be special education, disabilities, what have you, but the Latino community and Latino students within Texas certainly benefited from their community or their demographic being made a priority. That said, one of the big criticisms of the NCLB is that it really created a structure that was very strictly focused on testing standards and what scores were received on those tests. A lot of critics of this legislation point out the idea that because of the narrow focus on math and reading, a lot of classrooms started to gravitate towards those two subjects at the expense of a more comprehensive education. Um, and many individuals, legislatures, and educators alike were happy to see the NCLB upgraded to the ESSA under the Obama administration. Under the No Child Left Behind policy, there was an increase in the Latino community's scores in math, which is interesting to point out, but not in reading, based on statistics. So there's some measurable improvements made on academic achievement by the Latino community, but very limited results. By the time that we get to the Obama administration and signing of the Every Child Succeeds Act, this is something that a policy that teachers were happy to see. Some oversight being less oversight being taken by the federal government, and more of that going back to the states, in the sense that what standards should be appropriate and who should determine how to resolve or improve failing schools was some of that power is getting back to the states. That said, some critics of the Every Student Succeeds Act are, especially those advocacy groups within Texas, are weary that more power being given back to the states under the Obama administration is going to mean that we're going to see more of segregation issues and lack of access to bilingual education that we've had challenges with in the past. Because as with a few examples that I've been able to show in this presentation, Texas, since its inception, has had a very poor track record of advocating and trying to be proactive in increasing the educational access of Latin Americans within Texas. So, bringing this more towards present day, what are some current challenges to equal education that Latin Americans experience? So I think one of the key challenges under segregation is that we still, in 2019, we are still dealing with issues of segregation, even though many people would think that this is not an issue anymore. There's less overt versions of segregation, but one example just to point out how this happens, how this plays out, is the case of Santa Maria versus the DISD. And this was actually a case that involved Preston Hollow Elementary School, in which they were segregating students based on language ability. So even it was a bit complicated, but essentially, even though students had been tested and had sufficient English language ability to be with their white counterparts, Preston Hollow Elementary School was still separating them into ELL programs, and the school was not able to justify why they were doing this outside of a race argument. So this was a situation where schools like Preston Hollow Elementary School are or were, in the case of that school, still using different methods and means to segregate white students and Latin American students in their schools, but they're doing it in a more subtle ways, using other criteria to achieve that. We've also seen decreased oversight in segregation by the legal courts. And as noted by one Stanford study, we are seeing that when there's less oversight by courts, Texas tend to trend towards becoming more desegregated schools overall. Um, when we start to see segregation kind of gaps go up, it becomes harder and harder to reverse this trend. The second kind of big challenge that we're dealing with within Texas is we still have inadequate bilingual and English language learning access. I separate these two just because in talking with lots of educators, bilingual education and English language learning education are very different things, even though they are often lumped together. But in both cases, there's inadequate access. Some of the key factors to this are the fact that we have a rapidly growing Latino population within Texas. And if you couple that with the fact that Texas schools are still having a really hard time finding bilingual teachers and teachers with proper certifications, and training up enough teachers and incentivizing teachers enough to be trained up, this is something that is causing a lot of challenges. Not to mention that Texas still suffers from really significant underfunding when it comes to bilingual and English language learning education programs. Lastly, is the fact that there is still inadequate legal and financial support for the Latino community within Texas. We see higher rates of Latinos dropping out than their white counterparts. A lot of this has to do with the fact that families have less financial capital to invest in school endeavors, and there's a lack of school program funding around this, after school programming, college readiness, and so on. We also see that within Texas we have a very rapid growth of majority minority schools, and as we see that happening, it becomes more and more a challenge to get adequate funding for these schools. This is a complicated situation, but it has a lot to do with the fact that property taxes are still the main mechanism for these schools, as well as other issues. On top of all this, those Latinos who are immigrating and are undocumented workers and their families, we're seeing that DACA protection is being rolled back, as well as we have increased ICE activity, which is creating a culture of fear within Texas. So in conclusion, I just want to mention that under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, a lot of rights have been promised to Latin American community, Hispanic American community in Texas, but a lot of those have been stripped away. From this position, they've had to claw their way back in terms of eventually being able to overcome official desegregation, but still having to deal with the use of language as a method of segregating them from their white counterparts. Texas continues to have a very poor track record for improving these things, and it doesn't seem like it's going to get better that much anytime soon under the Trump administration, as the Trump administration really doesn't have much of a stance on education aside from being anti-Common Core, being very pro-school choice. I think that within the state of Texas, the value of Latinos to the progress of the state is still very much undervalued, and not properly historicizing the struggles and the contributions of the Latin community within Texas is contributing to these issues. It's worth noting that the vast majority of Latinos within the state of Texas are not immigrants, even though there's a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric going on within the state right now. And most experts that have written on this issue that I've come across and speaking with them have focused on another issue, which is that oftentimes desegregation and minority rights have often focused on the black versus white paradigm of segregation between blacks and whites, and oftentimes groups like the Latin community are left on the sidelines. So obviously there are many more layers to these issues, but this is just a quick overview, and I wanted to give you an idea of the historical challenges that Latinos have had, as well as what is the current state of affairs and where it looks like things are going from here. Thank you for your time, and please let me know if you have any questions. Below are my references that were used for the research of this paper and presentation.